Hey everyone, and welcome back to the SaaS community channel, where we talk about SaaS problems, solutions, and learn from each other. We are starting here a new series. I'm going to call it Stories of SaaS, and I'm basically going to invite guests who I think built really good SaaS solutions to tell us their story. What did they build? What was important? What were the challenges? What do they think was the best things ever? How they built really amazing things, and we can all learn. So just to kick off the series and give context, I want to chat about what is a world-class SaaS experience. And I think, like many things that are about the experience, it's really something that you know when you see and is a bit hard to define. But obviously, if you try to create it, you have to define what we're trying to create. So when I say world-class SaaS, and I actually went to a lot of people who are building SaaS and said, what is world-class SaaS for you? They all gave the same examples. They all said, oh, Stripe has a world-class SaaS. Notion is amazing. Asana is really great. I love the experience. I can even humble brag and say that people said that Confluent has a pretty good SaaS. So, and looking at all those examples, it's really about an amazing user experience that feels almost magical, that things just work. And it's also about an amazing developer experience. Like we talked last time about APIs, you need to have world-class APIs and world-class documentation, and really, especially if you're building a platform, especially if you're building a data platform, you have to attract great developers to build on your platform, and this means world-class APIs. And we're going to talk about what it takes to create it. I'm warning you, it's way harder than it looks. So to help with that, I invited Ram, who is currently my co-founder, but previously, in case you don't know, VP of Engineering running Confluent Cloud. So he is the guy who took Confluent Cloud for almost zero to what it is today, and he's here to tell us what it took to build this world-class SaaS experience. So welcome to the show, Ram. I'm excited to have you here.
Thanks, Gwen. It's a pleasure. I'm actually super excited to start the series. We think, we have learned a lot through our experience. We really wanted to share it. I'm pretty sure there are going to be other companies who have built similar SaaS products and would love to have them also, kind of participate in this series. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's important. If you want to participate, or if you really emphasize and you want to just say, oh my God, this was my experience too, comment here and we will have the conversation. So basically, you joined the cloud organization at Confluent after we already had a bit of a team, and you already ran the entire application group for Kafka. That was big, like there was Kafka and Connect and Streams and even KSQL, like it was just this gigantic org. And suddenly people were like, okay, maybe you want to switch over to cloud. What made you do it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I've always been an infrastructure engineer. Back at LinkedIn, back at Microsoft, I've just spent years building data systems and platforms. So in the first 2 years of Confluent, I was just building, Kafka and the ecosystem around it, like connectors and KSQL. I was really happy, excited, because I was really driving the vision, and I was leading all the data systems at Confluent. And I think this was around in 2017 when we had a 8%, 10% team on the cloud. The goal was essentially to build world-class SaaS experience that you just explained at the beginning of this talk. And they were actually started on it in terms of the journey. But at some point, the founders and essentially my boss at that point, Ganesh, wanted to essentially figure out how they can essentially take it to the next level in terms of execution and really building that world-class experience. And I'll walk you through like what is the current state when I joined. But that was a very, very important decision point for me in my experience at Confluent. is I had been doing data systems and platforms all my life. I had never built a SaaS product before that. And, I was generally, was asked whether can I take on this role around driving cloud. Initially I was like, hey, I've always been passionate about data systems. I have a vision for this space. Let me just go do that. But when I went back home that day, I was very disturbed because I felt like there's something wrong with my decision. And I was thinking deeply, and I was thinking, why was I there at Confluent? And it was fundamentally because I wanted to make the company successful. And to make the company successful, we all knew that SaaS was the future. If we built a successful SaaS company, our customers would be happy. We would actually have a very successful product and business. So that's kind of what made me think. And when I was thinking deeply about it, I was feeling like this was the most important problem that I can help solve for the company. So I went back the next day and I basically told the founders and my boss Ganesh that, hey, you know what? Let me go take this on. As much as I have done all the platform and data systems, this is the most important thing. The world and the future is all about SaaS, and let me actually essentially help with that. So that's kind of how it all started.
You're spot on how important it is, but did you also see it as like a hard technical problem, or like what was your expectation coming in on
Right. Right.
how it's gonna go?
Yeah. So as I said, I had never done SaaS before. So my experience around building SaaS features and experience and flows was very limited. So I was very naive to assume that, hey, this should be easy. Like everybody. I was like, hey, you know what? I'll go work on this for some time, get the SaaS experience done, and then hopefully come back in 6 months or 1 year back to my data system journey. And eventually that didn't happen. When I left Confluent very recently, it was essentially 4 years or slightly over 4 years building the SaaS experience for Confluent. And we're still building, and my organization was 200 plus people. So that tells you a little bit around how I felt about how the technology was to begin with and how easy it was. And then as I got into it, I found out it was very complex. It was not easy. I had a lot of learning to do, but it was fascinating. Like I learned a ton. But I would definitely, if I had to go redo this thing again, I would think really hard around how do we get to market really fast, much faster than what we did at Confluent.
Yeah, so let's take you all the way 4 years back. You joined this org. Some stuff was already in place, as you said, but some stuff was missing. Can you just kind of talk us through what you had? What were the gaps that you saw around? Yeah.
Yeah. So when I took over, we had two types of products for Confluent. We were actually providing Kafka as a service. We had a multi-tenant product and we had a dedicated product. And I'll tell you a little bit about what it is. So dedicated product is basically that a customer gets their own Kafka cluster provision, and they can essentially leverage that for their use cases. Multi-tenant cluster is basically where you have lots of tenants sharing the same infrastructure and same Kafka cluster, where you'll have a lot more better utilization of resources, and it'll be a lot more cheaper in terms of like your usage because you're kind of sharing your resource across multiple tenants. So we had these two offerings. But having said that, I do want to mention the state of the world was nothing close to SaaS, right? Honestly speaking, if you wanted to get a very basic thing around a cluster, you had to go through a massive manual process across different stakeholders in the company, including engineering.
Wait, I'm going to ask you about the provisioning a bit later. But yeah.
Definitely. I'll walk you through not the exact details, but we had to go through a lot of effort there. The second aspect was fundamentally, things like notifications, metrics for our customers to actually see insights, to know what's happening, being able to expand clusters and string clusters, and so on and so forth, were all non-existent. These are typically what you call as world-class SaaS, and we didn't really have that. We were just having some very basic manual process thrown at the problem, and the customers really didn't have a great experience because for everything they needed to talk to us, and it was taking days and if not sometimes weeks to really get any kind of useful value from our product.
And some of those things are actually very time sensitive. Like if you have an incident, you don't want to get notified like, 3 business days later.
Exactly.
So like if there are some places where really those are table stakes, but you're saying that even those were really not, it was still manual, like someone
Right.
had called the
Yeah,
customer.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it is natural. So here's the thing, right? Like if we were able to get these experience from day one, we would have loved to have it. It would have made a massive difference to our customers and our engineers in terms of what they can focus on in terms of the core product functionalities. But the reality was that was not the case. We had to spend, the product itself had a lot of broken experience, as I said. A lot of SaaS expectations that you have didn't exist.
Did
And
you have like usage-based billing in that time?
no, so we didn't have any kind of billing. We had a very
Any
manual.
billing?
Yeah, we didn't have any billing, but we had a very manual setup where we used to provide a link where the users can pay, but the invoice generation, everything was just purely manual. Um, there was no way to communicate to our customers unless we sent emails back and forth with them.
So clearly there were problems. You stepped into this role. Clearly there were problems just all over the place. What was like the one thing you knew you had to get right straight
Right.
away?
Right. So if you think about the customer journey, right? If you come log in and the first thing you do is to essentially provision a cluster to start using the cluster, right? It feels so obvious, but yet what they had to do was pretty much go talk to us. And it was a very painful process in terms of they would typically get a cluster anywhere from 3 days to 1 week to even start sending the first bits or bytes into the Kafka cluster. And that's kind of where we were. And that was the immediate most important pain point that we had to solve.
So
And
talk to me a bit about like, suppose that I'm a customer, I'm calling you and saying, hey, want a cluster. What happens next?
right. So, typically think about customers are onboarded to the company's organizational support desk. They will file a ticket through their support desk. And what we promised them is initially we didn't even promise them anything. We were like, we'll get back to you, right? And uh, and then typically what will happen is that ticket gets processed. Somebody looks at it on the engineering side, and remember that there'll be a lot more requests. So it is not something that you can take a look at the ticket or or the support ticket immediately. So we'll typically see it whenever we can, whenever people had time and bandwidth and cycles to actually act on it. And then they had to go actually do the manual provisioning and all of that. They had to go talk to support back and forth, trying to understand was the information even relevant or was it correct, incorrect, and support had to go back to the customers. Sometimes you had to pull in even the sales folks into this whole process because they had some context in their mind around what was supposed to happen that didn't translate into the support ticket. So you have to really bring all these people together to actually provision our first cluster. So initially there was no SLAs. Customers would essentially create the support ticket and just wait. Hopefully they think we'll get back to them. In some cases, it might have got lost. We just don't know because there was no really any good way to monitor and audit this whole flow. And then I think it took a lot of time. So that's kind of how it was in terms of the process itself.
Yeah, I bet customers loved it. Like just the way you described it reminds me of, getting a green card. You send a bunch of docs and then you wait. Who knows what will happen? When will anyone look at it? Did it get lost somewhere?
Yeah, that's
So
exactly
it
right.
just sounds very scary. And as you said, like the back and forth, like everyone's biggest dread who went through this process is that the authorities will come back and say, oh, you forgot to file these 5 docs back to the beginning, kind of thing. So it definitely like just sounds like an awful experience. But I'm actually interested, what was it like for the engineers who built it? Like what did they have behind the scenes in terms of tooling and like how did things work for them?
Yeah. So, the engineers themselves, as I said, there's a lots of, this whole state that I'm talking about was only possible with some level of automation.
Yeah.
If we didn't even have that, I think it would have been a nightmare. But the automation we had was limited, but we still had something. We had pretty much, all this cluster information that we were trying to manage on Terraform. Now, Terraform is this essentially this tool that enables you to define, think about it like infrastructure as code, where you can define a set of deployments, and then you can essentially deploy that change. And it has this whole reconciliation logic where it look at the infrastructure state, the current state, it look at what state you want, and it'll try to essentially make sure it can reconcile the production clusters to the state that it is, the intended state. So we had some level of Terraform automation. In addition to that, we had a bunch of scripts and runbooks where all of this information was really listed and documented. These were pretty long, all over the place initially. So that's kind of how the engineering state was. And there's an on-call or multiple on-calls. Their full focus was to just provision clusters every day, right? It was very painful, but that's kind of how we started doing this.
So basically, the on-call got a support ticket, and then they had to edit a Terraform file with some details and run a bunch of scripts, and then it created a cluster, and then they had to tell support who had to tell the customer, and that's like in the best case scenario. If you discover something is missing, you have to go back and forth and find out.
Yeah.
What was it like, working with this like manual process? Like engineers typically are not fans.
Yeah, I did want to mention one thing, right? Which is, as I told you, when I took it on, there was literally no guarantees or commitments to the customer. Now, we had this partial automation in place, but the first thing I could do was not, it's very hard to automate it end to end because there's tons of work that we'll talk about. But the first thing we did was, can we provide some kind of guarantees to the business? So we try to essentially say, let's throw more people at the problem, which is kind of, if you think about it, not the best experience for engineers.
You actually hired an engineer knowing that he will spend a lot of his time manually executing a process.
Exactly, right? Like we are like, okay, let's try to bring this down from 7 days to 3 days, right? In terms of SLA, we promised this SLA to the business and to the customers. And then what we did, the way we solved that problem was by hiring more engineers. And all they ended up doing was pretty much spending time in automating.
Yeah, and obviously they're engineers. They wanted to automate. They didn't want to do it manually.
Correct. And the big challenge here was, do you actually spend time in doing the manual provisioning for your customers, or when do you find bandwidth to actually do the automation, right? And it's a constant struggle.
Yeah. So how did you create time for the engineers to take it on?
So this is where the balance comes up, right? Which is, we did set up a 3-day SLA. First off, we obviously added more engineers to do manual work, addressing the support tickets and talking to support and customers in some cases. But we couldn't tackle all the requests because it was just fundamentally not possible to meet the SLA. So basically what I had to do was to essentially push back. And, in some cases we had to say we couldn't onboard the customers, at least in the SLA that they expect us to, or in some cases they had to drop out because, they were needing clusters right now, not two weeks after, because they had use cases that they had to try, and the engineers were wanting to they cannot stay idle waiting for us to give them a cluster in 1 or 2 weeks. So we had to do both. We had to define an SLA, we had to throw people at the problem, and we had to push back on the request so that we can give time to engineers to go do the full automation, to build that self-serve SaaS flows in terms of onboarding and provisioning flows that we needed.
And I think it's worthwhile explaining the impact to the business, because we couldn't recognize revenue until the customer was onboarded, but the salesperson basically had it written off the moment the deal was signed, and it kind of created a lot of tension if the deal fell through during the onboarding because customer wouldn't wait. What do you do with the quota? It was very painful on the business side as well.
And it was even worse in some cases, right? Because typically what happens is sometimes customers want to essentially do a proof of concept. They'll do a POC even before signing a deal. And when you have to do that, they needed a cluster.
And how do you prioritize that?
Yeah, they have prioritized it by working with their team and roadmaps. And they said, okay, now we have this next 2 weeks to do a POC. Give me the cluster. And we are like, hey, you'll get the cluster only after 2 weeks, which means they had to replan. Sometimes they just drop out. So even before even coming to a deal signing stage, we had to lose customers because we couldn't even prioritize them for proof of concepts.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to switch gears to talk about something positive. At some point, you did manage to give engineers time, and I think the next step was to basically create an internal API. So were there any interesting learnings while moving from like this, a lot of Terraform and scripts to an internal API?
Yeah. So, even before some internal APIs, the obvious sequence of events was, hey, let's at least get an internal API so that engineers can use the internal APIs to provision. And that'll be a lot better than doing all this manual process. Now, but before we can do that, we had to essentially build automation, as we spoke about. Now, the state of all this metadata that we're talking about around the cluster and the provisioning was all in Terraform. So what we had to do is we have to move all the state to our database, right? Which was essentially our entity store that stored all our information about our customers and the SaaS entities and also all the entities about our clusters. And so a lot of time was spent in doing that. And in addition to that, we also had to build orchestration layers to essentially build these SaaS flows that I was talking about. It is not probably obvious, which is these flows that we're talking about are asynchronous in nature. In most of these flows in at Confluent, in terms of a SaaS experience, is they're all very async, right? Which is you kind of invoke some operation. That operation will happen sometime downstream. You're not going to get a synchronous response back, and it could either succeed or fail. And if it succeeds, you have to do some certain events. If it fails, you'll have to essentially initiate certain events. So how do you essentially do something like this that can be initiated through the product? So we had to build orchestration layers that the product can actually talk to eventually, but at least even the internal APIs could talk to, that can orchestrate these SaaS flows for us asynchronously. And that's kind of what we set out to do. Obviously, as you can expect, this was a really, really hard engineering problem to get right.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like all cloud APIs are async, and some engineers are good at syncing asynchronously. Some engineers, especially like someone who is more new, you don't really learn how to do it in the university.
Yep, exactly. And these systems are very hard to build, and the correctness is extremely hard, which is, you don't even, how do you even debug such a system where everything is asynchronous? How do you audit the system to make sure that the expected action actually even happened? How do you reconcile the intended state and the new state? How do you ensure that we don't actually by mistake delete an existing state? And imagine this, like imagine we said the existing state, the existing state was 10 clusters, and we wanted to create yet another cluster. And let's say by mistake, you just removed one cluster from the expected state. What will happen is the
Bye data.
pretty much end up deleting the cluster that you're not supposed to delete. So it's a very complex system to build. And I think it is not just specific to the cluster creation, like many SaaS flows that we had to go through this journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And like just like some stuff like you just mentioned, like synchronizing Terraform and a database, there are no connectors that do it. Like you have to create it from scratch, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's also very hard for a connector to do this because there's a lot of business logic that needs to essentially be part of the flow.
Yeah.
So it's not just bytes in, bytes
That's a
out.
database. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not that. The other thing I also want to mention was, as I was talking about Terraform, we had to move all this metadata over to our database, but it was also challenging where we had to keep the state of the Terraform because that was still the source of truth. We have to live migrate these metadata over, and we had to somehow switch over our cluster information on our APIs to start making the database the source of truth. So there's a lot of work to enable this from manual process to eventual full automation.
Yeah, I think that's like just a big takeaway. If you can start with the database as a source of truth, it's actually slightly better source of truth. But then databases don't have APIs, they don't tie into any sales process. It's just really, really hard to get it right the first time.
Exactly. What was the other challenging part here was, imagine that if you knew the journey that we know today, and as a thought exercise, we went back and we had to build these systems. It would have been a lot simpler approach, right? Because you know that you needed an entity store with all the SaaS information. You knew that you needed an orchestration layer. You knew that you needed all these business integrations like to all the systems, but it is kind of an afterthought today. Like it's easy to say it today, but when you start with this journey, you don't know. Like we didn't even know what SaaS meant. We didn't know what it took to build it.
We didn't know what information we need from customers. Like I remember when we had to discover that VPC period customers need to give us certain type of network information. If you are private link, you care about different things. You need different type of information. Like it's just from step one, everything. It was a huge learning journey.
Exactly, and the other part here was that it was such an important thing for engineers. They were so committed to doing this because it relieved them from a lot of pain in on-call process, trying to help the customers manually. And fundamentally, they really believe that the customer can only succeed by having these APIs. So, kudos to them. They spent a lot of time building these systems. I think this was the one key takeaway I have working at Confluent and building these things. Obviously, we built an amazing SaaS experience, but the engineers that they spent time in learning these aspects of SaaS, it was very hard, and it was not really the interesting part. They came in, Kafka was the product, and the SaaS aspects was something that was table stakes. They spent a lot of time doing this, but they were essentially motivated to do this fundamentally because of the business success. But everybody would have loved if this was there from the right from the day one.
Yeah, and we actually needed those rock stars who are good at infrastructure and distributed systems, because we know and we found out, but we kind of knew that some of those problems, like building the databases and automation and orchestration, we knew those are hard problems. But then you have to take essentially rocket scientists, and maybe for them, like they don't.
Yeah.
Like I feel blessed that they realized the magnitude of the challenge.
And it was really, really hard to hire, right? Because these engineers that you're talking about, really strong platform and infrastructure engineers are very, very hard to get. Yeah. So
we actually pissed off some customers by hiring their best infrastructure.
So it was hard. And so I think, this journey that I'm talking about is not something I would recommend for others, but it is definitely something that what we went through. And, looking back at it, I'm actually glad that we crossed that, that.
I was just thinking that when I see companies struggle a lot, like over a long time, like basically stay in this struggling state and never make the product really successful, a lot of it is that they don't, like the team itself is underpowered. Like, I don't want to say that the people are not good enough. Sometimes it's just not enough people to do everything that is needed to do. So like, yeah, just having this really strong initial team and the trust of the companies that allowed us to build a bigger team when it was needed was so important.
Yeah, like at the end of it, I had 200 plus people just working on all these SaaS features.
Yeah, and I don't know if we could have done it with anything less, to be honest.
Right. And they were still stretched thin. Like there's so much to do every day.
I want to circle back a bit into the journey, because last we left, we had an amazing internal API and that we're grateful for the engineers who built it. But then we needed to build it into the product. And my guess is that, okay, you had an API, building it to the product is about 2 lines in the UI and you were done, right? It was not a big deal.
So I'll tell you, honestly, people underestimate the work involved to take an internal API to make it a public API. I used to constantly get this request from business and product, hey, you already have this API, why could you not just expose it to your customers? But the honest truth is it's a lot of work, from defining your APIs to make sure that it is actually intuitive and it will actually work for your customers, to making sure that you have all the quotas and limits in place to make sure that you are appropriately throttling, to capacity planning, because when you have a public API, guess what people will do? They'll script against that API. They're going to essentially hammer against your APIs. So it was so important to make sure that our capacity planning was in place. And finally, documentations and examples were also extremely important. In addition to that, we also had to integrate with things like Terraform, so that customers can actually run Confluent Cloud as an infrastructure as code, right? So it is significant.
You just mentioned gazillion things, and I think you forgot error handling when you're interfacing with a customer is very different than error handling when you're interfacing with engineers.
Exactly.
We had a part where we had to send back an email your customer is created. That's its own kind of part of the flow. Engineers did not need it. They could just go in and pick, is my cluster ready? We ran a database query. So I do think like we massively underestimated pretty much every single aspect of the experience.
Exactly. And a self-serve provisioning flow, I think when you talk about it, is you want to essentially have the customer go to the docs, look at the APIs. They need to be able to invoke those APIs, and the cluster has to get provisioned, and they need to get notified when it happens, and they need to know when it's ready to start being used, right?
Oh yeah, and maybe even healthy.
Exactly, and healthy, and which means you need to have some kind of metric and notification to them on the UI to say this is actually ready and healthy. So,
and an API, because which engineer would actually want the status in an UI? You want an API for your metrics and status.
Right. And a simple flow like this, we're just talking about one flow all this along, and it just took a lot of time for us.
Yeah, and because like it's just way more involved than from the customer perspective than we thought.
Right.
So I think one last question, we're heading toward the end. If there was any features that you regret deprioritizing, that basically you think is really important and you in 4 years it never became the top priority.
Yeah, this is one of the things that till I left, I had been asking for was fundamentally, customer success and support, which is, oftentimes what happens is customer takes an action and then they're waiting for this action to happen. But it's very important for them to know that did this action actually happen? And then if it didn't happen, was it a problem on my side or was it on problem on the Confluent side? And then they need to be able to understand what instruction they should be following to essentially make sure that they can fix the issue. Now, this is pretty common for every single API operations and SaaS flows that you do, right? Which the customer initiates. And what you really wanted was some way of like connecting all these flows to our notification system, making sure the notification system was intelligent to essentially send appropriate messages to the customers around what actions they can take, also provide clarity around whether it was a Confluent issue or was it a customer issue, maybe even point them to our status page to show them, hey, our status page looks good. Why don't you try these steps on your side, right? But these are things that are very, very important for customer success, for customers to feel really happy about the product. And you don't expect them to talk to somebody and go back and forth for all of this, which creates a very frustrating experience for them, right? So I remember sitting on multiple calls, trying to make sure our customers were happy and making sure, reassuring them that this is going to come, in the future. But that was one thing that I would have wished that, it was one of those things where you have so much to do, and building these SaaS flows are so important for customer success, but you never had the bandwidth because there is so much in terms of like other critical areas that we have to invest in, like security and networking and all of that.
And I think it's one other place where while we were building it, the bar went up from interaction with support via email, which was acceptable at some point. And now everyone wants the chatbots in the product, support to know exactly what page you open the chatbot on to complain about something. Like those are all things that actually, while we're struggling with things that may have been a bit more basic,
totally.
all moved on.
Exactly. And my personal opinion here is, I think the future of SaaS, especially on the support side, is I think in-product support experience for customers is going to be how the world will and SaaS will evolve. I think what really users want is to be able to have the product guide them in terms of the journey, in terms of what the issues were, and in terms of like whatever Confluent can help them should be through the in-product experience. So it's a long way to go from where we are to that state, but I think we'll see more and more companies do this.
I really liked how when I reached out to Zoom via the chatbot, they actually had, do you have a technical question? Do you have a product question? Or do you have a pricing question? And they could direct it to product sales and support accordingly. And I thought it was pretty cool. If anyone listening knows the product manager at Zoom who did it, definitely connect us, because I think that will be a great story on how they landed with this particular design. With that said, Ram, thank you so much for.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, it was great sharing my story. You know, the SaaS journey is hard, and we would love to have more people say such stories. I was actually fortunate enough to have experienced this and be able to share the story. But at the same time, I wish nobody goes through this journey as well. So, thanks a lot.
Thank you.